The Middle Ages were a dark time. Disney castles are based on the medieval era. When you think of medieval Europe, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Religion, nobility, knights, warfare. The Dark Ages? Greetings, wise time traveler. I am your loyal advisor, Xin Bai. This broadcast will debunk some myths about medieval Europe and its widespread stereotypes. Let's talk about inbreeding. It's often said that medieval European nobles favored inbreeding. This idea is a common sight on the internet, but in fact, this wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, religion deeply influenced social ethics. The Roman Church actually forbade marriage between close relatives. Until the 12th century, the Church banned marriage within 7 degrees of kinship. In 1215, this was changed to 4 degrees. This included direct and collateral lines, in-laws, and even godparents. Some even exploited these rules. Growing tired of their wives, they'd find proof of a close relation to legally end the marriage. As for the nobles who actually wanted to marry relatives, they were usually condemned by the church and society. Take King Richard III of England and his niece, for example. Though it was just a rumor, it was seen as a huge scandal at the time. The popular image of aristocratic inbreeding in Europe actually comes from the period after the Middle Ages. For instance, the famous Habsburg family wasn't like that during the medieval period. Did medieval lords have the right of the first night? The right to sleep with a bride on her wedding night. For many, the idea that medieval lords had this right comes from the movie Braveheart. However, whether this right truly existed in medieval Europe, or if it was widely practiced, is highly debated. Nothing is set in stone. Since the end of the Middle Ages, scholars have been researching and debating the topic. In summary, in medieval Europe, there did exist a lord's privilege under the name of right of the first night. But according to records, its purpose was to collect a marriage tax. It wasn't about the lord actually sleeping with the bride. For example, a 14th century French poem, Baudoin de Seborque, describes a cruel lord who planned to exercise this right, unless the bride gave him part of her dowry. In other words, it was blackmail. Even in literature, it seems, this act wasn't seen as legitimate. Most depictions were highly critical. If we look closely, many references to this right come from myths, legends, plays, and literature. For example, in the Irish legend The Wooing of Emer, a king possesses this right. Shakespeare's play Henry VI, Part 2, and Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro also feature similar stories. Research by British scholar G.E. Howard also shows the medieval church would sometimes ban consummation on the wedding night, only to have the newlyweds pay a fine to lift the ban. Basically, it was just an excuse to extort more money. Of course, many scholars have mentioned or acknowledged the existence of this right. The French philosopher Montesquieu, in his work The Spirit of the Laws, mentioned the existence and practice of this right. In 1527, Scottish historian Hector Bose wrote that before the 11th century, the lord's right of the first night existed in Scotland, until King Malcolm III, influenced by his wife, abolished this practice. It was replaced by a fee. So, did the right of the first night really exist? And was it a common practice? We can only say it's unknown. We'd need a time machine to know for sure. In reality, even if the right existed, many nobles might not have wanted to exercise it, except for a few with peculiar tastes. Anyway, it's best not to see things in black and white. Medieval people only bathed once in their lives. Medieval people only bathed twice in their lives. Medieval people only bathed 3 times in their lives. Alright, we've touched on this before. The bathing only a few times examples do exist. But that was mainly for a few ascetic monks. Many ordinary monks still bathed regularly. After all, who likes feeling dirty? Starting in the High Middle Ages, many cities and towns built public bathhouses. Even the lower classes could bathe weekly. In fact, the trend of not bathing actually appeared after the Middle Ages. That particular social trend, the Middle Ages, were a dark age. Whether this period was truly dark is debatable. But in modern research, the term Dark Ages actually refers to the early Middle Ages, from the 5th to the 10th century, not the entire medieval period. The concept of the Dark Ages originated with the 14th century Italian scholar Peter Arch. He believed that compared to the light of the Roman era, the post-Roman period, the Middle Ages, was dark. Then, in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the conflict between Protestants and the Roman Church, it became common to view the Catholic-dominated Middle Ages as a dark period. In response, the Catholic Church of that era romanticized the High Middle Ages, viewing it as a time of great religious and social harmony. Not dark at all. These historical debates were the flame wars of their time. After the 16th century, most scholars linked the term Dark Ages, specifically with the early Middle Ages. But starting in the 20th century, scholars began to avoid the term Dark Ages. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, to avoid making overly simple value judgments. That could be misleading. Second, modern research has shown that many periods in the Middle Ages weren't as dark as once thought. There were many advances in science, culture, and other areas, especially during the late Middle Ages. In short, it's important to be objective and avoid looking at the past with bias. Could noble titles be upgraded in the Middle Ages? If you think medieval titles worked like a career ladder, where you could be promoted from manager to director, or even commissioner, you'd be mistaken. There are indeed examples of medieval titles being upgraded or elevated. But these were special cases in specific circumstances, not a standardized system. For example, when Bohemia was elevated to a kingdom, for the most part, a noble title was an identity tied to specific lands and powers. It wasn't something that changed easily. It's not like a baron could do a good job and get promoted to an earl. So, if you're writing a novel, when you want to level up a character, just find a reason to grant them a new, higher title. They would simply keep their original titles as well. Disney princes and princesses are based on the Middle Ages. Medieval royalty in your imagination. Actual medieval royalty. The classic Disney princess is an image familiar to us all. The Disney castle is a dream destination for many children. But the classic image of Disney princesses, princes, and castles is actually based on the era after the Middle Ages. During the early modern period, the model for the Disney castle was built in the 19th century. Neuschwanstein Castle. The corseted gowns of Disney princesses and the formal wear of Disney princes are also mainly based on 17th to 19th century styles. Medieval women were obsessed with corsets. As mentioned, the corseted gown for women only became popular after the Middle Ages. It was fashionable right up to the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the 18th century, wearing the corset as outerwear even became a trend. This craze reached a pathological peak in the 19th century. In contrast, most medieval women's clothing looked like this. While some dresses were fitted at the waist, many were comparatively loose-fitting. However, starting in the late 14th century, a high-waisted gown became popular. It began to fade out around the end of the medieval period. It remained popular in Italy for longer, where women still wore it into the early 16th century. While it might resemble later corseted gowns, its main feature was a high waistline, not an extremely cinched waist. Witch hunts were rampant in the Middle Ages. Now, to say the medieval church completely ignored the issue of witchcraft would be incorrect. Since the dawn of Christianity, there has always been criticism of witchcraft. But when it came to so-called witchcraft, the medieval church was relatively tolerant in its actions. It was mostly limited to strong condemnation. The church hierarchy even issued bans on witch hunts to avoid targeting traditional folk customs by mistake. In 1080, Pope Gregory VII wrote to the King of Denmark, stating that to prevent the unjust treatment of innocents, he forbade the execution of people accused of causing storms, failed crops, or plagues. Of course, there were cases of actual punishment for witchcraft, but these mainly punished those who used witchcraft to commit murder. For example, the Salic law defined the crime of murder by sorcery. This was essentially premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances, so the severe punishment is understandable. Witch hunts only began to grow more frequent in the late Middle Ages. Of course, many of these were politically motivated persecutions, like the trial of Joan of Arc. But even then, witch hunts weren't widespread. The witch hunting craze didn't peak until the 17th century. During the 30 Years' War, an estimated 35,000 to 50,000 people were executed. A large portion of them were innocent. Alchemy was heresy in the Middle Ages. To modern people, alchemy seems like a mysterious, ancient art, but in medieval Europe, alchemy was often a serious academic discipline, much like physics or chemistry today. Even some clergymen studied it. They would openly discuss their alchemical findings with the Pope. The famous friar, Roger Bacon, once wrote to the Pope about the importance of studying alchemy. However, there were periods when the Church did suppress alchemy. In 1317, Pope John XXII issued a decree opposing alchemy. Anyone who practiced it would be punished, but the punishment was usually a fine, not burning at the stake. So, in the Middle Ages, alchemy wasn't considered a serious heresy or black magic. Rulers had their own armies of knightly orders. This arrangement is common in many modern fantasy novels. In reality, the most common military knightly orders of the Middle Ages, which were true armies, like the Templars, Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order that everyone's heard of, did not belong to a king or noble. They were military monastic orders of the Roman Church. Some of these orders later evolved into independent military powers. Another type of knightly order, favored by monarchs, such as the Order of the Golden Fleece and the Order of the Garter, were mainly honorary, more like elite clubs, rather than organized armies. Everyone in the Middle Ages wore full plate armor. Actually, there was no full plate armor in the Middle Ages. In fact, generally speaking, both of these statements are stereotypes. The stereotype that all medieval knights wore full plate armor appeared quite early. This is mainly because many medieval-themed movies and video games love to feature full plate armor. In reality, full plate armor didn't appear until around the 14th century. For most of the Middle Ages, chainmail, lamellar armor, and the like were dominant. But then, some people see any plate armor and claim it's not historically accurate for the Middle Ages. That's not quite accurate either. By the 15th century, fairly typical, full plate armor had already appeared. Furthermore, some armor in pictures or movies that looks like full plate armor and gets criticized might actually be transitional armor like a coat of plates. This type of armor appeared in the 14th century. All right. If you've heard any other popular ideas about medieval Europe that you suspect might be stereotypes, feel free to share them in the comments below. In conclusion, I believe that for many things, it's best not to speak in absolutes. This is especially true for subjects like history, due to a lack of archaeological evidence or vague records. Many things can't be set in stone. The further back in time we go, the truer this is. Treat all sources of information as points of reference. You don't need to treat any single opinion as gospel, and believe it without question. Many research findings are just the most reasonable speculations that get us closer to the historical truth. Besides, viewpoints themselves can change depending on your needs. If you rigidly stick to one side, it's not like they're going to pay you for it. Just be flexible. It's all about adaptability. Just kidding. The most important thing is to assess each case on its own merits. Based on your specific needs, you should refer to the relevant viewpoints and sources. Of course, logical consistency is a very important prerequisite. Try not to retcon yourself. Well then, I hope everyone can find what they're looking for in the pages of history. See you next time.